Hi, my name is Mel, and my camera's deciding it is on the play today. Um, I'm going to talk about transgender people because I am one. I am transgender. I am gender fluid, not because it's the latest fad. It's because that is how my gender identity aligns. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what transgender is, what the research shows, what medical body says, what does discrimination cost, and more importantly, because so many people will call transgenderism some sort of religion, it's not. So I'm going to talk about transgender people like me, the science, the evidence, and rights that we should have. Because yeah. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is give clear definitions like gender identity, sex assigned at birth, dysphoria, and gender affirming care. Then I'm going to talk about the science like neuroanatomy, brain imaging, twin and genetic studies, prenatal hormones, and cross-cultural history. Then I'm going to talk about the medical consensus like WPATH, the Endocrine Society, APA, AMA, AAP, OSPATH, and the World Health Organization, amongst many others. So, what also going to talk about outcomes, what the evidence shows about affirming care, mental health, and regret rates. Then I want to talk about discrimination, the measured human cost of stigma, exclusion, and hostile legislation. And then I'm going to talk lastly about support and rights, why this is identity, not a religion, and what this sort of support would look like. Okay, being positive, affirming of people. So look, obviously the very first thing to go into with people, I think, is what is meant by transgender. Okay, so there's sex assigned at birth. The label is usually male or female. There are some people born with undefined genitalia and they're not sure. So you recorded at birth based on external anatomy. Sex itself is multi-layered. It is not binary. Chromosomes, hormones, gonads, and anatomy do not always align. And yep, there's a whole heap of intersex. Yep. So gender identity, which is not your biological sex at birth. Okay, gender identity is a person's deep internal sense of being male, female, both, neither, or something else. It is not visible from the outside and it is not chosen. Gender expression, how a person outwardly presents, clothing, name, voice, mannerisms, expression varies hugely amongst cisgender and transgender people alike. So I'm going to explain these terms very sort of plainly. Okay? So transgender is just an umbrella term for people whose gender identity or expression differs from what is typically associated with the sex they are assigned at birth. Okay, and you can see the reference there. Cisgender, a person whose gender identity aligns with the sex they are assigned at birth. It is a neutral descriptor, not a slur. Non-binary, an identity that is not exclusively male or female. In Australia's trans pathway studies, 48.6% of trans young people identified as non-binary, and I identify as non-binary or gender fluid. Trans man or trans women, a man assigned, so a trans man is a man assigned female at birth. A woman and a trans woman is a woman assigned male at birth, but a trans woman is not a man. They are a trans woman. A trans man is not a woman. It is a trans man. Trans is an objector. It's never a noun or a verb. Gender diverse, a broad inclusive term in Australian clinical guidelines for full range of identities beyond the binary. Because that is just reality, okay? So, being transgender, most important thing to remember and to get across, it is not a mental illness. It is an identity. Gender dysphoria is the clinical significant distress that some, not all, trans people feel when their body or social role conflicts with who they actually are, with their, so their body is not representing to what their identity is. The diagnosis exists to describe distress and unlock access to care. It does not describe the identity itself as disordered. So being transgendered is not disorder. Gender dysphoria is the clinically significant distress that some transgender um, can feel. Okay? In 2019, the World Health Assembly adopted the ICD 11, which removed trans related categories from the mental and behavioural disorders chapters entirely, which is a good thing because it's not a mental illness or a behavioural disorder. It is just not. Gender incongruence now sits on a chapter on conditions related to sexual health, retaining a code for healthcare access while removing the label of a mental disorder. Yep. Depathologization was a deliberate act of evidence based policies, not political concession. So the evidence was overwhelming. And that's what it found. It wasn't based on people being woke or whatever. It was on science-based evidence. And if anyone tells you differently, they're flat out lying to you. So what does gender affirming care actually mean? And it is going to mean different things for different people. So care is individualized and staged. Surgery is not performed on any child, and no single pathway is required or even done by every adult trans person. So, what gender affirming care frequently means, okay, could be social, so name, pronouns, clothing, hair, documents, no medication. For most children, this is the only step involved, right? So, social transition. Then there's psychological, supportive therapy to explore identity, manage distress, and cope with stigma. Never to change who someone is, to help them deal with who they are and where they might want to go from there, okay? If anywhere, okay? Then for pre, then there's medical. For adolescents and adults, puberty suppression, or, before the gone into puberty, hormone therapy, and for some adults, surgery under clinical guidelines. Okay, so this is when it is thought to be the most medically appropriate treatment by a group of specialists, not just one. Then there's legal, updating identity documents so daily life, travel, and employment can proceed without any forced disclosure. Okay, so that is what is meant by gender affirming care. Okay, no, you cannot make someone trans if they are cis, and by the way, you can't make a trans child cis. All you'll do, unfortunately, in the instance of many trans youth and kids, is end up with a lot of suicide. Because if you're not going to accept them for who they are, then, they can't be anything. We can't be anything else other than we are. So this is why I'm doing this, because this affects me and affects all the other trans people out there. Okay, it is this level of hatred and going on against people who got no money and no power, and only about 1 to 2% of the population. We're not after your kids. If your kid's trans, they're trans. If you just love them and support them in whatever they need, then you'll be fine. But if you're going to try and turn them into being not trans, that is where a lot of the harm comes in. So, a small population, a large body of research. So, I'm just looking at US survey, like a 2022 US trans survey. It was less than 100,000 individuals. 859 trans young Australians aged 14 to 25 surveyed by Trans Pathways, the largest Australian study of its kind. 6,000, roughly 6,500 LGBTQIA plus young Australians surveyed in writing themselves in for, the largest national survey of its kind. Claims that this is new or an unstudied phenomenon do not survive contact with the literature. Transgender identities has been documented across cultures for centuries and studied systematically for decades. It's certainly not new. We're just talking about it now because I think trans people have had enough of being discriminated against and been stigmatized. You know, really, that's just what's happened. So, science. What does the science say? Where does gender identity come from? Okay, 4 independent lines of evidence converge. Neuroanatomy. Post-mortem studies find sex-differentiated brain structures that track gender identity rather than birth-assigned sex. Okay, so there's brain differences in people who are trans, you know? Brain imaging. Large multi-site MRI analysis find trans people's brain structure differs measurably from cisgender controls. Genetics. Twin studies show that identical twins are far more concordant for gender diversity than fraternal twins. Prenatal hormones. Girls exposed to high prenatal androgens show measurably shifted gender-related identity and behaviour. No single study obviously proves anything just on its own. The strength of the case lies in 4 methodologically independent fields and studies, right? A biological grounding for gender identity established well before a person ever chose or can choose anything. So, neuroanatomy is the bed nucleus of stria terminalis. The central division of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, or BST, is a sexually dimorphic limbic structure. It's larger in males than in females. Like Zhu and colleagues found that in trans women, the BSTC was female typical insides regardless of sexual orientation and adult hormone levels. Cuvier and colleagues confirmed the finding at the level of neuron number, not just volume. Trans women had female typical somatosine neuron counts in the BST, and Jean de Veras and Swab showed that the BST sexual differentiation is not complete until adulthood, indicating an interaction between early brain development and later maturation. So this is very clear that there is something going on in the brains and hormones of trans individuals, and it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us, just means that we are different and we should be accepted and celebrated for that. So brain imaging, the enigma and meta-analysis. Transgender Persons Working Group, an international consortium pooling MRI data across many research sites to overcome the small sample problem that limits single studies. So it's published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine in 2021. This mega-analysis pulled structured MRI scans from research groups across Europe, Americas, and Asia. Trans men and trans women showed brain morphology that differed significantly from cisgender men and cisgender women. They did not simply resemble their birth assigned sex. Findings were regionally specific than global, consistent with gender identity being a distinct feature of brain organization. Pooling across sites addresses the most common criticism of early work, that individual studies were too small to be reliable. So they've done more. And there's a lot more research been done since then and still ongoing, but like all scientific evidence shows that biological sex and gender identity, one, are not the same thing, and gender identity is a very real thing. So, genetics, what twin studies show? A 2025 systematic review of the twin literature in behavior genetics found consistent evidence that genetic factors contribute substantially to gender diversity. Concordance for gender dysphoria is markedly higher in monozygotic or identical twins rather than in diazygotic or fraternal twins. The classic signature of heritable influence. So, a part of our DNA is responsible for this. Documented series include identical female triplets, concordant for gender dysphoria, and monozygotic trans male twins reported in JSON case reports. Heritable does not mean deterministic. The evidence supports a complex interaction of genes, prenatal hormones, and brain development, not a single trans gene and not a social contagion. Yep. Prenatal hormones, evidence from CAH. Congenital adrenal hypoplasia, or CAH, exposes genetically female fetuses to unusually high levels of androgens before birth, a natural experiment in prenatal hormone influence. Berenbaum and colleagues found that girls with CAH show shifts in gender-related activities, attitudes, and identity that scale with the degree of prenatal androgen exposure. Follow-up work showed that these girls responded differently to gender socialization itself, suggesting hormones shape how children take up gendered information. The implication is direct. Prenatal hormone, environmental influences, gender-related development. Gender identity has biological inputs that precede socialization entirely. What the science does and does not claim, okay? Gender identity, so well supported. Gender identity has biological correlates that are measurable and predate any choice. It is stable and not modifiable by therapy. Conversion practices cause harm and do not work. Multiple independent methods all converge on the same conclusion. So the almost honest limits. There is no single biological marker or test for being transgender. Sample sizes in neuroimaging remain modest and effects are group level, not diagnostic. None of this is required to justify rights. Dignity does not depend on the brain scan. And also, what is also not being claimed is that if someone goes through a gender reassignment surgery, no one is claiming that their biological sex has changed. We're not saying their chromosomes or anything have changed, but we are simply aligning their body to what their gender identity is. Okay? But no one's saying, the chromosomes changed or anything like that. Okay? No one's claiming that. And transgenderism's been documented across cultures and centuries, like sister girls and brother boys, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Gender identities carry cultural, social, and spiritual meaning, not just merely a translation of Western trans categories. Hijara, a recognized third gender across South Asia with roots stretching back millennia, legally recognized in India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan. Two-spirit, a modern pan-Indigenous North American term for gender roles held in high regard in many nations long before that country was colonized. Falafin and Falatama, I hope I'm saying that correct, long-standing Samoan gender categories integrated into the film community rather than treated as deviants. Yeah, so, and not just them, there's been a lot. Okay, so what does the medical profession actually say? The WPATH standards of care. So there's 259 pages of guidance across 18 chapters published open access. There's 18 chapters, including the first devoted to non-binary people. 2022 is the year of publication. Okay, so there's probably going to be another one more. It's built on informed consent, individual capacity, and individualized assessment rather than a fixed gatekeeping requirements. Okay, so it is very individualized. There's not going to be one solution that fits all. So removed real life experience as a blanket prerequisite for surgery. Most genital surgery now requires one referral rather than two because, like, people, know who they are. Developed by a multidisciplinary international committee of clinicians and researchers and published in a peer-reviewed journal. Okay, so this is clinicians and researchers across many disciplines across different countries. So the Endocrine Society and the AAP. Endocrine Society is 2017. Its clinical practice guideline on endocrine treatment of gender dysphoric or gender incoherent persons was co-sponsored by the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists and the American Society of Andrology, the European Society for Pediatric Endocrinology, and the European Society of Endocrinology, the Pediatric Endocrine Society, and WPATH. It standardized terminology, established treatment frameworks, and affirmed the endocrinologist's role within a multidisciplinary team. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, its policy statement called for comprehensive gender-affirming and developmentally appropriate care for transgender and gender-diverse youth. Yes, and even though America's now probably trying to stop that for all it's worth, and not just America, lots of countries are trying to stop it. And all you're going to do is a lot of kids with severe suicide, because you cannot stop them being trans and trying to force them not to get, like, puberty blockers or a social transition or medical, counseling. It's gonna cause multiple problems. All right. So, okay. So, psychology, medicine, and the global profession. The American Psychology Association adopted a landmark policy affirming unobstructed access to evidence-based care for trans, gender diverse, and non-binary people of all ages, and stating that government bans disregard the body of research and the legal role of parents. Then there's the APA, reaffirmed that supportive mental health care greatly reduces the risk of depression, suicide, and other negative outcomes for trans and non-binary youth. And, social transition. Also, American Medical Association advocates at state and federal level to expand access, reduce stigma, and dismantle discriminatory barriers, and opposes so-called conversion therapy, which should be banned everywhere. The World Medical Association, its statement on trans people, affirms that trans identity is a part of the natural spectrum of human diversity. Yep. And more than 30 major medical associations worldwide have issued statements supporting healthcare for trans people. Yep. So, Australian clinical standards. The Australian Standards of Care and Treatment Guidelines, developed at the Royal Children's Hospital with the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and the University of Melbourne. These guidelines set the national benchmarks for trans and gender diverse children and adolescents, endorsed by OSPATH and cited by the UN Rights Council. OSPATH stands for Informed Consent Hormone Therapy. Australian protocols giving GPs and primary care clinicians practical, evidence-based guidelines for initiating gender-affirmative hormone therapy in adults through an informed consent model suited to Australian primary care. The World Health Organization, the 72nd World Health Assembly in 2019, who adopted the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases. Trans-related categories were moved from the chapter on mental and behavioral disorders. Diagnoses such as transsexualism and gender identity disorder were retired because they're not relevant. They were replaced by gender incongruence, relocated to a chapter on conditions that relate to sexual health. The purpose was explicit: reduce stigma while preserving a diagnostic code so people can access healthcare and get insurance coverage. This is a global standard used to record health conditions in a number of member states, including Australia. Does gender affirming care work? Longitudinal and population evidence. De Veras and colleagues followed 55 young trans adults from before puberty suppression through to after gender affirming treatment. The first longer term longitudinal evaluation of the approach. Gender dysphoria resolved, psychological functioning improved, and well-being was comparable to same age peers in the general population. In 2026, a study in the JAMA network found trans use prescribed puberty blockers had significantly lower adjusted odds of diagnosed mood disorders and suicidal thoughts and behaviours from trans youth who did not receive them. Okay, so puberty blockers do help. Australian data from the AIHW shows that gender affirmative care, social, medical, legal, is associated with better mental health and lower suicidality amongst trans and gender diverse people. A puberty suppression or puberty blocker, sometimes called, is reversible and it buys time. Is used precisely to avoid irreversible changes while a young person and their clinicians work things through. And why puberty blockers are a really good idea if required. You know, regret is rare and rarer than in most surgery. So, like, it's about a 1% regret rate, okay? Which is less than elective surgery, knee replacement surgery. So, you know, I've got a nice chart on this slide. You can look at that. But the regret rate is actually quite low. The real problem is access, not enthusiasm. 3 in 4 trans young people surveyed by Trans Pathways reported difficulty accessing appropriate mental health care that's appropriate to them needing gender affirming care or whatever it is. In 2022, a US trans survey, 66% of respondents rated their health as excellent, very good, or good, well below the 81% recorded in the general adult population. A gap driven, you know, by barriers to care. Amongst people who stopped or reversed a transition step, 1/3 reported that anti-trans harassment and discrimination played a role. Pressure from families, employers, religious communities, and providers, not a change of identity. Waiting lists, cost, distance from service and clinicians untrained in trans health are practical obstacles. None of them are solved by restricting care further. What does discrimination actually cost? So I've got a slide here talking about the 2022 US Trans Survey. Less than 100,000 people owe trans and non-binary respondents from all of their states. 66% rated their health as okay. 1 in 3 said they stopped transition because of harassment, discrimination. All right. It doesn't mean that trans people are inherently unwell. It means that social and medical transition, if they're accessible, are constantly associated with better health and well-being outcomes, and that discrimination is driving the gap, and also driving a lot of people, to suicide. The minority stress model explains a pattern. So you can see from this slide here, there's digital stresses like discrimination, rejection, violence, misgendering, hostile media, and legislation. Events that happen to a person outside. Proximal stresses, expectation of rejection, concealment of identity, and internalized transphobia absorbed from surrounding culture. Health outcomes, elevated anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicidality. The predicted result of chronic stress, not of being trans, of discrimination, of hatred, of bigotry. Protective factors, affirmation, family acceptance, community connection, and access to care. Buffer the effect, or help to, anyway. So this slide here shows what trans pathways measured in Australia. And there was 859 trans young Australians aged 14 to 25. And what sort of diagnosed with anxiety, for instance, 72.2%. Whereas others are less so. And you can see diagnosed with depression, suicidal thoughts, ever self-harmed is 79.7%, whereas everyone else for their age range, or for 12 to 17, was 10.9%. So it's not being trans that is the problem, it's being not accepted, not having access to care, the discrimination, the bigotry, the hatred. We are trans, but the bigotry and hatred and not receiving, gender affirming care is what the problem is, not being trans. Writing themselves in 4 and private lives 3. 90% of gender diverse participants reported high or very high psychological distress in the previous 4 weeks. 71% had thoughts about suicide the preceding 12 months. 54 had self-harmed. 14% have attempted suicide the preceding 12 months. Writing themselves in 4 surveyed, 6,500 roughly LGBTQIA plus young Australians, 14 to 21. The largest study of its kind ever conducted in Australia. Private Lives 3, Australia's largest national survey of LGBTQIQ adult health, documented the pattern. Persistent disparity in health and well-being alongside concerning levels of discrimination, harassment, violence, despite recent, legal progress. Denying rights causes harm. Up to 72% increase in the past year of suicide attempts among transgender and non-binary young people caused by state-level anti-transgender laws. Okay, and this is what's going to happen. I mean, people are trans. You just get over it. I mean, I don't know what else to tell you, but not giving them gender affirming care, telling them that they're wrong, they're broken, they're just, this is not what some God wants or whatever. It's not going to stop them from being trans. All they're going to get from that, all we get from that is you don't like us for who we are. And who we are is not, we have got, we are not cisgender, we're transgender. I don't know how else to put this, quite honestly. Being transgender is not a religion. I'm having to say this because some dills think it is. There is no belief system. For one, a religion usually is a set of beliefs about the supernatural, sacred and moral order. Being transgender just asserts nothing at all about any of that. It is just a description of who a person is. There's no conversion, no doctrine. Either you're transgender or you're not. There's no scripture, clergy, ritual, deity, creed. Nobody is recruited. Trans people exist in every religion across none. All right, across every culture and every ethnicity. Yep, we just exist. We're here. A medical and legal matter. The WHO classifies gender incongruence in ICD 11. Australian law protects gender identity as an attribute under the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984. Neither treats it as a faith, and it's not. The client, this is obvious crap, you know. So, this slide just goes in belief versus evidence. A religion, it's like God, faith, revelation, it's generally not falsifiable. Being transgender, it's testable. Neuroanatomy, genetics, endocrinology. A religion is recognised by whatever religious institution. Transgender is recognised by who? WPATH, Endocrine Society, APA, AMA, AAP, OSPARP, amongst others. Chosen. A belief can be adopted or abandoned. Is it chosen? Who knows? I don't know. Gender identity is stable and not, but like you may feel about it differently in different times. It's not modifiable by therapy. You can come to terms with who you are by therapy. In law, freedom of religion, okay? And being transgender is projected attribute under anti-discrimination laws, which it should be, because, who would, it just is. Rights and law, Australia and beyond. So Australia, trans and gender diverse people have the same legal rights as everyone else. The Sex Discrimination Act protects people from discrimination on the basis of gender identity. Australian law that recognises that gender is based on more than biology. It considers how people live, feel, and express themselves. Requirements for legal gender recognition still vary by state and territory. Globally, legal recognition ranges from self-determination models to jurisdictions that criminalise gender expression outright, which is awesome. Not the UN Rights Council, human rights, protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender has cited Australian research. Where legal protections do exist, transphobic violence and harmful media messaging still persist. Law is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Yep. Huge amount of discrimination and crap that goes on, quite honestly. What actually protects trans people? Well, family acceptance, and quite often that is not the case. The single strongest protective factor. Acceptance at home is repeatedly associated with sharply lower rates of depression and suicide attempts. So if someone in your family or friends is trans, you just got to accept it. Affirming spaces, schools, workplaces, and community groups where a person's name and pronouns are simply used without argument. Access to care, timely, affordable, informed clinical care, social, medical, or legal, is consistently linked to better mental health. Anti-discrimination laws and straightforward document changes reduce daily exposure to forced disclosure and refuse of service. Every one of these is available at no cost to anybody else. Nobody loses a right when a trans person gains recognition. Having to use someone's pronouns and preferred name is not discrimination against you. It is just basically recognizing them as a person. All right? It's not me as some sort of discrimination against you. So what does support actually look? Always use the name and pronouns a person gives you. I mean, otherwise you're just a piece of shit. If you slip, correct yourself, apologise, move on. So you don't have to make a big apology speech. Just go, oh, look, stuffed up, sorry. Do not ask about surgery, genitals, or person's formal name. These are medical and private, exactly as they would be for anybody else. Interrupt transphobia when you hear it, including when no trans person is present. Silence is read as agreement. Push for access, not just tolerance. Shorter waiting lists, trained clinicians, inclusive forms and facilities, straightforward document change. Support the evidentiary the evidence base. Every major medical body worldwide backs a gender affirming care. Treat it and, it as, like anything to the contrary is requiring a source. Follow trans-led organizations and give money and time where trans people are already doing that. Trans people are not a debate. We are not something that our rights and our existence is not something that should be argued about. We're not something that should be used in a political football game to take away from what the rich, the powerful, and the corporations are doing. I mean, we're having an election soon, and they're going on now about some parties going on about how trans people or whatever. And like, trans women are not a problem. Trans men are not the problem. Gender diverse people like me, gender non-binary, are not the problem. It's the rich, the powerful, and corporations. I mean, but, we're not a political football. We're not someone you can just say, oh, I don't like you because you're against my religious belief or personal beliefs or whatever. I mean, quite honestly, we deserve the same rights and recognition. And yes, you do have to use our preferred name and preferred pronoun. That is just simply you would do for anyone else. And just because you might not like trans people, you may not agree with it, but just giving them that is just bare basic, It's not really that hard. So this is what I'm saying. The evidence is behind us. It was not, this is, not something that should be going on and on and on about. Okay, these are the references that I've pulled, and this is just a very basic slide, basic presentation. There's a lot more that could be said, but please, 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 like, if you're a half decent person, please support LGBTQIA plus rights worldwide, not just in your country or just in your community. We need, like, you know, it's not, we are a very small percent of the population, but if you do not care about trans rights, then your rights could be lost the next day. That is just all there is. Anyway, hope that helps. Thanks.